Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. They say blood is thicker than water, but nobody warns you what happens when that blood becomes poison. At 73 years old, I thought I knew everything about sacrifice, about family loyalty, about the price of keeping peace. I was wrong. The truth came to me not in a moment of revelation, but slowly, like watching paint peel from a wall you've stared at for decades without really seeing. My daughter Sarah has always been what people politely call strong-willed. Even as a child, she possessed an ability to make everyone around her orbit her needs, her moods, her endless crises. I told myself this was just her personality, that some children simply require more attention than others. When her father died 15 years ago, I became her sole source of emotional and financial support. At the time, it felt natural, even necessary. She was going through a difficult divorce, struggling to raise my grandson Tommy, and I had just retired with a comfortable pension. What else was I supposed to do but help? The helping started small. A few $100s here and there for groceries when money was tight. Babysitting Tommy after school and on weekends so Sarah could work her various jobs. Listening to her tearful phone calls at all hours about her ex-husband, her bosses, her friends who had wronged her. I became the stable foundation upon which she built her increasingly unstable life. Over the years, the requests grew larger and more frequent. When Sarah's car broke down, I bought her a new one. When she lost her job, I covered her rent for 3 months. When she decided to go back to school, I paid her tuition. Each time, she promised it would be the last time, that she would pay me back once she got on her feet. Each time, I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because the alternative was too painful to consider. Tommy became the justification for everything. Sarah would remind me that he was my only grandchild, that he needed stability, that surely I didn't want him to suffer because of circumstances beyond his control. She was right, of course. Tommy was innocent in all of this, and my love for him was deep and uncomplicated. But somewhere along the way, loving Tommy became synonymous with enabling Sarah, and I lost the ability to distinguish between helping my grandson and being manipulated by my daughter. The pattern became so entrenched that I stopped questioning it. Sarah would call with a crisis. I would solve it with money or time or emotional labor, and then there would be a brief period of calm before the next emergency arose. I lived my life in a constant state of low-level anxiety, always waiting for the phone to ring, always wondering what disaster would require my intervention next. My friends began to comment on how tired I looked, how I never seemed to have time for our old activities, but I deflected their concerns with vague explanations about family obligations. The first real crack in my denial came during Tommy's high school graduation party. I had organized and paid for the entire event, spending weeks planning every detail and hundreds of dollars on food, decorations, and gifts. Sarah arrived late, complained about the decorations I had chosen, and spent most of the party on her phone arguing with her latest boyfriend. When Tommy's father showed up unexpectedly, she created a scene that ended with guests leaving early and Tommy in tears. The next morning, instead of thanking me for the party or apologizing for her behavior, Sarah called to complain that I had embarrassed her in front of Tommy's friends by serving store-bought cake instead of making one from scratch. The criticism stung not because it was harsh, but because it was so typical. No matter what I did, it was never quite right, never quite enough. I found myself apologizing for things I shouldn't have needed to apologize for, making excuses for choices that had been perfectly reasonable. Later that day, I sat in my empty house looking at the leftover decorations and half-eaten food, trying to remember the last time Sarah had said thank you for anything I had done. I couldn't. The realization was like a physical blow, leaving me breathless and disoriented. I had become so accustomed to being treated as a resource rather than a person that I had forgotten what it felt like to be appreciated, to be seen as someone whose feelings mattered. Meanwhile, my own health was beginning to suffer. Years of stress and putting Sarah's needs before my own had taken their toll. I had developed chronic insomnia, often lying awake at night worrying about whatever crisis was currently consuming her life. My blood pressure was climbing despite medication, and my doctor had begun asking pointed questions about stress in my life. I brushed off his concerns, Just as I had learned to brush off the concerns of friends who gently suggested that perhaps Sarah was taking advantage of my generosity, the final straw came on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. Tommy had been accepted to college with a partial scholarship, and we were celebrating at dinner when Sarah announced that she had quit her job because her boss was unreasonable. The timing was not coincidental. With Tommy headed to college, Sarah needed a new crisis to ensure my continued support. She had already calculated how much money she would need to get by until she found another job, and she presented her budget to me over dessert, as if my agreement was a foregone conclusion. But something was different this time. Maybe it was watching Tommy's face fall as his mother's drama overshadowed his achievement, or maybe it was the casual way Sarah dismissed my suggestion that she try to work things out with her boss before quitting. Whatever it was, I felt something inside me shift. Like a piece of machinery finally refusing to turn after years of grinding operation. That night, I called my sister Margaret, who lived across the country and had maintained a polite but distant relationship with Sarah over the years. We had barely spoken in months because I had become so consumed with managing Sarah's life that I had neglected most of my other relationships. Margaret listened without judgment as I told her about the dinner, about the years of financial support, about the constant emergencies and my growing exhaustion. When I finished talking, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. She told me that love was not supposed to be exhausting, that healthy relationships involved mutual respect and consideration, and that I had been enabling Sarah's dysfunction for so long that I had forgotten what normal looked like. She reminded me of the woman I used to be before I became Sarah's perpetual safety net, the woman who had traveled and volunteered and maintained friendships and pursued hobbies. The next morning, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. When Sarah called to follow up on our conversation about her latest financial needs, I told her no. Not no with explanations or conditions or alternatives, just no. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that I wondered if she had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp with disbelief. She reminded me of all the times she had needed me, all the sacrifices I had made, all the reasons why I couldn't abandon her now. But I held firm. I told her that I loved her and always would, but that I could no longer be her solution to every problem. I explained that I was setting some boundaries for my own well-being, and that those boundaries would include no longer providing financial support for her lifestyle choices. She could call me for emotional support. She could visit for holidays and family dinners, but the bank of mom was permanently closed. Sarah's reaction was swift and predictable. First came the tears and the accusations of abandonment. When those didn't work, she switched to anger, telling me I was selfish and cruel, and that I was hurting Tommy by refusing to help his mother. When anger failed to move me, she tried bargaining, promising to pay back every penny I had ever given her and swearing that this would truly be the last time she needed help. Finally, she resorted to silence, refusing to answer my calls or respond to my messages for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, I experienced a roller coaster of emotions that left me questioning my decision daily. The guilt was overwhelming at times, whispering that I was abandoning my daughter in her time of need, that a good mother would find a way to help, regardless of the cost to herself. But alongside the guilt was something I hadn't felt in years: peace. My phone wasn't ringing constantly with emergencies. I wasn't losing sleep worrying about Sarah's latest crisis. I had space to think about my own needs, my own wants, my own life. I used that space to reconnect with old friends who had gradually drifted away as I became more consumed with Sarah's problems. I joined a book club at the library and signed up for a watercolor painting class at the community center. I began taking evening walks around my neighborhood, something I had stopped doing because I was always afraid I might miss an important call from Sarah. Slowly, I began to remember who I was, beyond my role as Sarah's mother and rescuer. The breakthrough came when Tommy called me directly to thank me for the graduation party. He told me he was sorry his mother had been difficult that day, and that he had wanted to call sooner but hadn't known what to say. We talked for over an hour about his plans for college, his hopes for the future, and his gratitude for all the support I had given him over the years. Hearing his perspective helped me understand that maintaining boundaries with Sarah didn't mean abandoning my grandson. In fact, it might mean being more available to him without the constant drama his mother created. Sarah eventually resumed contact, though our relationship was strained and awkward. She seemed genuinely shocked that I had maintained my boundaries despite her various attempts to manipulate me back into my old role. Our conversations became shorter and more superficial, but also more honest. Without the constant undercurrent of financial need, we could actually talk about other things: Tommy's progress in school, my new hobbies, even Sarah's gradual progress toward taking more responsibility for her own life. 6 months later, Sarah called to tell me she had found a new job and was doing well. She didn't ask for money, and she even offered to take me to dinner to celebrate. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental after years of one-sided giving. We went to a modest restaurant, not because I was paying, but because it was what she could afford, and something about that felt right and healthy and normal. The conversation that night was different from any we had shared in years. Sarah actually asked about my life, my friends, my painting class. She listened when I talked instead of waiting for her turn to speak about her own problems. When she did mention challenges she was facing at work, she framed them as obstacles she was working to overcome rather than crises requiring my intervention. For the first time in memory, I felt like I was talking to my daughter, rather than managing an employee who happened to be related to me. Tommy thrived in college, calling me regularly to share his experiences and seek advice about everything from choosing classes to managing his social life. Our relationship deepened in ways that wouldn't have been possible when every interaction was filtered through Sarah's needs and dramas. He thanked me often for my support over the years, but he also expressed relief that his mother was finally learning to handle her own problems. He had been carrying guilt about my financial support of his family, wondering if his needs were the reason I seemed so stressed and tired all the time. As the first year of my new boundaries passed, I began to understand that what I had thought was love and family obligation had actually been fear and codependency. I had been so afraid of being seen as a bad mother that I had allowed myself to be treated badly by my own daughter. I had confused enabling with caring, financial support with love, and exhaustion with virtue. The guilt began to lift as I realized that setting boundaries had actually improved my relationship with both Sarah and Tommy, even if it had taken time for the benefits to become apparent. The changes in my own life were dramatic and surprising. My insomnia disappeared within months of setting boundaries with Sarah. My blood pressure stabilized. I lost weight without trying, probably because I was no longer stress eating or too exhausted to prepare proper meals for myself. Friends commented on how much younger and more energetic I seemed. I felt like I was waking up from a long, exhausting dream and rediscovering myself after years of being lost in someone else's chaos. My relationship with money also changed in profound ways. For years, I had lived with constant anxiety about my financial security, even though I had a comfortable pension. I had been spending so much on Sarah's emergencies that I never felt stable or secure. Once I stopped being her personal bank, I discovered that I actually had enough money to live comfortably and even pursue some dreams I had put aside. I booked a trip to visit Margaret, something I hadn't done in over a decade because I never felt like I could leave town in case Sarah needed me. The trip was revelatory. Spending time with Margaret reminded me of who I had been before I became consumed with managing Sarah's life. We visited museums, took long walks on the beach, and stayed up late talking about books and politics and philosophy. Margaret told me she was proud of the changes I had made and the courage it had taken to set boundaries with Sarah. She also gently pointed out patterns in my behavior that I was still working to change, like my tendency to over-explain my decisions and seek approval for choices that were mine to make. During the flight home, I reflected on how much my life had changed in just over a year. I was healthier, happier, and more connected to people who genuinely cared about me. My relationship with Sarah was more honest, even if it was less frequent. Tommy was thriving without the constant undercurrent of family drama. I had rediscovered interests and friendships that I had neglected for years. Most importantly, I had learned that I could love my daughter without sacrificing my own well-being, and that setting boundaries was actually an act of love for both of us. The second year brought new challenges and continued growth. Sarah went through another difficult period when she broke up with her boyfriend and struggled with depression. This time, instead of swooping in to fix everything, I offered emotional support while maintaining my financial boundaries. I listened to her concerns, offered practical advice when asked, and connected her with resources for professional help. It was difficult to watch her struggle without stepping in to solve her problems, but I had learned that my interventions had often prevented her from developing her own coping skills and resilience. Sarah surprised me by rising to the occasion. Without the option of falling back on my financial support, she found inner strength she hadn't accessed in years. She sought therapy, joined a support group, and gradually built a life that was more stable and self-directed than anything she had achieved when I was constantly rescuing her. She began to take pride in her independence and self-sufficiency, and our conversations shifted from crisis management to genuine sharing of experiences and emotions. Tommy noticed the changes in both his mother and grandmother, and he began to understand family dynamics he had been too young to recognize before. He told me he was grateful that I had stopped enabling his mother's dysfunction, even though it had been painful to watch at the time. He said he had learned important lessons about personal responsibility and healthy relationships by observing our family's transformation. He also expressed relief that he no longer felt caught between his mother's needs and my exhaustion. Meanwhile, I continued to build a life that was centered on my own values and interests rather than other people's emergencies. I joined a hiking group for seniors and discovered a love of nature photography. I volunteered at a literacy program and found joy in helping adults learn to read. I deepened my friendships and even began dating again, something I hadn't done since my husband's death because I had convinced myself I was too busy with family obligations. The man I began seeing, Robert, was a retired teacher who had raised 3 children as a single father after his wife's death. He understood family dynamics and the challenges of adult children, but he was also clear about his own boundaries and expectations. Being with him helped me see how much I had normalized dysfunction in my relationship with Sarah. He treated me with respect and consideration, asked about my needs and preferences, and contributed equally to our shared experiences. The contrast with years of one-sided giving was stark and enlightening. Robert's perspective on family relationships was both compassionate and pragmatic. He loved his children deeply, but had learned to distinguish between supporting them and enabling them. He shared stories of difficult conversations he had initiated when his own children were struggling, and how setting boundaries had ultimately strengthened their relationships. His example gave me confidence that I was on the right path and that healthy families could love each other without sacrificing individual well-being. As my 3rd year of maintaining boundaries approached, I realized that the woman I had become was both a return to my authentic self and an evolution beyond who I had been before. I was more confident, more discerning, and more protective of my own energy and resources. I had learned to recognize manipulation and respond to it with calm firmness rather than anxious compliance. I had developed a stronger sense of my own worth that didn't depend on how much I could give to others or how much they needed me. Sarah and I settled into a new rhythm that felt sustainable and healthy. We talked regularly but not obsessively. We celebrated holidays and special occasions together, but I no longer felt responsible for managing every aspect of her emotional life. She had learned to solve her own problems and make her own decisions, and I had learned to trust her ability to do so. When she did ask for advice, it was as an equal seeking perspective rather than as a dependent expecting rescue. The relationship wasn't perfect, and probably never would be. Sarah still occasionally tested my boundaries, usually during times of stress when she reverted to old patterns of thinking about our relationship. But I had developed the skills and confidence to maintain my limits without guilt or anxiety. I had learned that saying no to inappropriate requests was actually a way of saying yes to healthier interactions and mutual respect. Looking back now, I can see that the years I spent as Sarah's rescuer were not entirely wasted. They taught me valuable lessons about the difference between love and codependency, between helping and enabling, between being needed and being used. They also showed me how strong I could be when circumstances required it, and how much I was capable of enduring for someone I loved. The challenge was learning to apply that strength and endurance to protecting my own well-being rather than absorbing someone else's chaos. Today, at 76, I live a life that is quieter but richer than the one I had during the crisis years with Sarah. I wake up each morning knowing that my day will be shaped by my own choices rather than someone else's emergencies. I have energy for the people and activities that bring me joy. I sleep peacefully at night without wondering what catastrophe tomorrow might bring. I have learned that peace is not selfish, that boundaries are not cruel, and that loving someone sometimes means refusing to participate in their dysfunction. The greatest gift of this journey has been discovering that I am enough, just as I am, without constantly proving my worth through endless giving. I don't need to be indispensable to be valuable, don't need to be a rescuer to be loved, and don't need to sacrifice my own well-being to be a good mother. These lessons came hard and late in life, but they came at exactly the right time to save not just my relationship with Sarah, but my relationship with myself.